She was lying on her back on cold concrete, and she was bleeding, and she was the calmest person in the building. The wound in her left side was not mortal. She had established that in the first 3 seconds after she went down. A clinical assessment, rapid and without sentiment. The kind that comes from training so deeply embedded, it no longer requires conscious thought. She had a system for these things. She had always had a system. Her left hand was pressed flat against Nolan Pritchard's chest. He was unconscious. 40 seconds now, which meant his blood pressure had already dropped past the threshold where most men stop fighting and start dying. The tourniquet on his right leg was cinched to the third click. She had placed it with one hand while the other held the radio. She had done it without looking down. Her right hand held the handset to her ear. Tango position, northeast corner of the structure. Elevation approximately 12 feet. He is using the window frame as a rest. You have a clean line from your current position if you move 4 feet left. Her voice did not shake. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the warehouse walls, 3 men heard those words and moved without question. They moved because the voice coming through their earpieces was the steadiest sound any of them had heard in the last 7 hours. Steadier than the gunfire, steadier than the wind coming off the ridgeline, steadier than their own breathing. The shot came from outside. Silence followed. Then hail, low and controlled. Target down. We are clear. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. No more. Then she opened them and went back to work on Pritchard's chest and counted his breaths and did not think about the concrete beneath her, or the blood soaking through her left side, or the 7 hours that had brought her to this floor. 7 hours earlier, she had walked into a room full of men who looked at her and laughed. Camp Lejeune sits at the edge of the Carolina coast the way a man sits who has forgotten how to rest. Present, enduring, carrying its history in the worn paint on its buildings, in the silence over its rifle ranges long after the last shot has been fired. It is not a place that welcomes softness. It has never tried to be. The briefing room in Building 114 had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. Metal table, fluorescent lights humming at a frequency just low enough to ignore. Maps pinned to corkboard with the casual precision of men who had been reading terrain their entire adult lives. Coffee sitting on the burner since before dawn. 10 men sat around that table. Between them, more than 200 combined years of military service. Operations in places that did not appear on public maps. Under orders that did not exist in any official record. They had the faces that come from years of being outside and carrying weight and making decisions that could not be unmade. When they looked at a room, they were not seeing it the way other people saw rooms. None of them looked up when the door opened. Then one did. Then all of them did. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall, 118 pounds. She wore a standard-issue Navy medical uniform that was slightly too large in the shoulders, and she carried a single bag that she set down beside the chair at the far end of the table, with the quiet efficiency of someone performing a task they had performed 10,000 times. Her hair was dark and pulled back without ceremony. Her eyes moved around the room once, not nervously, not defiantly, in the way a person looks at a new space when they are trying to understand its geometry. She was 26 years old. The silence in the room changed. It filled. Wade Brennan, Staff Sergeant, 12 years Ranger, hands like load-bearing equipment. He leaned 3 inches toward the man beside him without saying a word. The look on his face said everything that needed saying. At the head of the table, Colonel Garrett Blackwood did not look up from the map in front of him. He was 57 years old and carried himself with the frame of a man who had spent those 57 years making the world accommodate him rather than the other way around. 24 years in Delta Force, Desert Storm, 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. He had the stillness that comes not from calm, but from absolute economy. Every movement intentional, every word chosen, every second of attention allocated with the precision of a man who understood that attention is a finite resource and waste is a form of failure. He let her settle into her chair. He let the silence extend 6 seconds past where it needed to be. Then, without raising his eyes from the map, who sent the intern? The room did not laugh loudly. These were professionals. But something moved through it, a collective release, a small exhale of the tension that had gathered when she walked through the door. Brennan looked at the tabletop. A man near the back produced a sound that could have been a cough. Reese Callahan said nothing. She sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her and looked at the topographical spread on the wall. The Blue Ridge Range, the red pin near the Shenandoah Valley, the grease pencil notation she had been reading for 30 seconds. She looked at it the way a person looks at something they are memorizing. Blackwood pushed back from the table and walked to the corner of the room, where his phone sat beside a cold cup of coffee. He dialed a number from memory. 3 rings. She was specifically requested. The voice on the other end was flat and final. Do not ask why. Blackwood looked at the phone a moment after the line went dead. Then he set it back on the shelf. He was a soldier. He had followed orders he disagreed with before, and he had learned at considerable cost the difference between orders worth fighting and orders worth enduring. He turned back to the room. His eyes found Reese Callahan at the far end of the table. She was still looking at the map. Task Force Raven. He picked up his briefing notes. Let us begin. The mission had a name and a clock. The name was Sullivan Crease. The clock said 72 hours. Crease had spent 19 years as a case officer for the CIA's Special Activities Division, the part of the agency that existed to do what the agency could not officially do. 52 years old, extraordinarily careful, possessed of the particular patience that comes from spending a career in environments where impatience ends careers in the most literal sense. 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning, he had left his apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, abandoning a half-finished cup of coffee and a phone with the battery removed, and he had taken something with him, a file, physical, not digital, assembled over years with the kind of patience that generated either deep admiration or deep fear in the people who encountered it. The Defense Intelligence Agency had been brought in quietly. Task Force Raven was the result. 10 operators. One objective. 72 hours before Crease was scheduled to complete a transfer to an unknown party at an unknown location somewhere in the Blue Ridge Range. Blackwood laid it out in 11 minutes. Then he looked around the table. Questions came about the file, about Crease's known associates, about terrain and communication protocols and the rules of engagement for a former American intelligence officer operating on American soil. Nobody asked about Reese Callahan, not directly, but when Blackwood assigned roles, Callahan forward medical. The pause that followed was not nothing. Brennan's jaw moved slightly. A man named Bennett Shaw cleared his throat. Reese wrote her assignment in the small notebook she had brought and said, "Yes, sir." 2 words. She offered nothing more. The first test came 40 minutes later. Blackwood appeared in the equipment room while Reese was conducting inventory and said without preamble that he needed a forward treatment station established in the adjoining bay. Full setup, ready for mass casualty intake. 18 minutes. Then he left. The adjoining bay was 40 feet of bare concrete with 3 folding tables stacked against one wall and a drain in the center of the floor that smelled of motor oil and old water. Reese looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she began. She moved without wasted motion. The tables arranged themselves into the configurations she had memorized from a field manual she had first read at 15 and reviewed every year since. Intake, treatment, stabilization, the layout designed for a single operator working without support. The kit opened and sorted itself onto clean surfaces in logical sequence, triage tags fanned in a row. 3 CAT tourniquet units sat at the front of the primary table, left side, where the hand finds them without looking. She finished in 14 minutes. Blackwood came back and walked the length of the station without speaking. He checked the tourniquet placement, the IV setup, the airway management tray. He found nothing out of place. His expression did not change. A checklist is not a firefight. He walked out. What he did not see as he left was the particular stillness with which Reese watched the door close. Not anger, not defeat. The patient steadiness of someone who has heard this sentence before, in different rooms from different people, and has learned that the only answer worth giving is the one that requires no words. Brennan found his moment that afternoon. The team was running gear checks in the main bay, and the table near the door held equipment staged for the mission. Among it, a Barrett M82A1, its bulk occupying more table space than anything else in the room. The rifle sat in its case with the quiet authority of something that expected to be taken seriously. Brennan lifted it out to verify the scope mount and set it down. And as he turned to reach for the bolt, the weapon slid 2 inches toward the edge, near Reese's clipboard. Her right hand came up and stopped it. That was ordinary. What followed was not. It lasted less than a second, the fraction of time that exists below conscious thought. In the part of the nervous system that has been trained until training becomes reflex and reflex becomes something indistinguishable from instinct, her thumb moved 2 inches, no more. It found the curve of the pistol grip and settled against the trigger guard in the exact position of someone who had been holding this weapon or one very much like it for a very long time. Then her hand lifted away and she went back to the clipboard. Brennan had not been watching. Victor Hale had. Hale was 49 years old. 15 of them spent in Navy SEAL support operations. He had a way of watching things that looked like not watching. A visible absence of attention that was in fact its precise opposite. He was sitting 6 feet away appearing to inspect a radio. He had been appearing to inspect it for some time. He reached for the small notepad in his breast pocket. He wrote one word. He folded the paper in half and set it flat on the table beside him. Then he went back to the radio, and his face did not change at all. The moment that mattered came at 16:40 hours. A full medical evaluation, standard protocol before field operations. Bennett Shaw, the team's designated corpsman, was running through the checklist quickly. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen saturation, injury disclosures. He reached Nolan Pritchard, took his readings, normal across the board, moved on. Reese had been standing near the door waiting her turn, watching Pritchard for the last 2 hours in the way she watched everything, without appearing to. A slight asymmetry in how he held his left shoulder, a shallow quality to his breathing, intermittent, most visible when he stood still. The wince, once, barely visible, when Brennan clapped him on the back. Shaw handed Pritchard his paperwork and called the next name. Reese stepped forward. Pritchard, when did the vehicle impact happen? Pritchard looked at her. 3 days ago. I was cleared. I know. Take a deep breath for me. She listened. What she heard. What Shaw had not listened long enough to hear, or had not known precisely what to listen for, was the faint wet asymmetry of a lung not fully inflating on the left side. Subtle. Now, in 12 hours under exertion, under altitude, under stress, it would announce itself in a way that could not be managed with a clipboard and a checklist. Tension, pneumothorax, early stage, left side. She was already moving. I need him lying down. What followed took 4 minutes. She located the second intercostal space mid-clavicular line, left side with the speed of someone for whom anatomy is not a reference system, but a language spoken fluently without translation. The needle decompression released the pressure with a sound that made Pritchard exhale in a way he had not been able to exhale in 3 days. He looked at the ceiling. Oh, the sound of something obvious in retrospect. Shaw had not moved. He was watching her hands. Not the procedure. The hands. The angles. The certainty in them. The absence of hesitation that is not the same thing as confidence and is not the same thing as experience, but is the product of both operating together over a very long time. Where did you learn that? He asked. Field manual, Reese said. She was already repacking the kit. Shaw looked at her for a long moment. 11 years as a Navy corpsman, he knew what field manual technique looked like, and he knew what he had just seen, and he knew those two things were not the same. The sleeve. It happened as she reached across Pritchard to secure the IV line. 3 inches. 4. Far enough. The scar began at the outer edge of her left shoulder and ran down the length of the upper arm in the line that shrapnel makes. Not straight, but deliberate in its length and depth and texture. The kind of tissue that results from a wound closed under conditions that do not permit the luxury of a proper surgical environment. Cleaned in the field, sutured in the field, healed imperfectly because imperfect healing was the only kind available. It was not a small scar. It was not the kind of scar that comes from a car accident. Garrett Blackwood was standing in the doorway. He had come to check on the delay. He had been watching the procedure for 45 seconds. Watching Shaw's face. Watching the efficiency of someone who did not move like a medic fresh from a training program. Now he was looking at the scar. Where did that come from? Reese looked at her own arm, then at him. Car accident. Last year. He held her gaze. The room was very still. Everyone in it. Shaw. Pritchard flat on the table. Two team members who had drifted to the doorway. Was doing the same arithmetic and arriving at the same answer. 24 years. That was how long Blackwood had spent watching people lie to him. He had sat across tables from insurgents and informants and politicians and men who believed their own deceptions. And he had developed a capacity for recognizing deliberate falsehood that was as reliable as any instrument he had ever been issued. He took one step into the room. "You are a liar," not loudly, not with anger, with the flat certainty of a man stating a condition of the weather. Reese did not flinch. She did not look away. She pulled her sleeve down with one smooth motion and finished securing Pritchard's IV line before she looked back. "Colonel, is my medical history relevant to this mission?" The silence stretched. He had no grounds. He had a scar and 24 years of pattern recognition, and none of that constituted grounds in a room operating under official protocol. She had performed a procedure that had potentially preserved a man's operational readiness. She had done it correctly. She had done it faster than his designated corpsman. "Get your kit squared away. We move at 1800. He turned and walked out. In the corridor outside, Hale was waiting. He held out the folded piece of paper without introduction. Blackwood took it, unfolded it. One word in Hale's careful hand. SARC, Special Amphibious Reconnaissance Corpsman. A program so selective its graduation rate had never exceeded 20%. Navy corpsmen trained to operate alongside SEAL teams in Tier 1 environments. Not in support roles, not in the rear, but inside the worst of it with the skills to function in both worlds simultaneously. Blackwood stood in the corridor with the paper in his hand and thought about the angle of her thumb against the trigger guard. Thought about the speed of the needle decompression. Thought about the scar. Thought about what kind of wound left a mark like that and what kind of person walked away from it. And what kind of person then applied for a position as a contract medic on a DIA task force and sat at the end of a briefing table looking at maps she had clearly never needed to memorize because she had already memorized them. He folded the paper, put it in his pocket. He had learned over 24 years to recognize people who had already paid the price he was only beginning to calculate. He walked toward the operations center and did not look back. That night, after the briefing, after the final equipment check, after the team dispersed to their quarters for the 4 hours of sleep the schedule permitted, Reese sat alone in the empty medical bay with her kit open on the table in front of her. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and removed an envelope. The corners were soft from handling. The seal had been broken and resecured with a strip of medical tape. The handwriting on the front was a man's, deliberate and clear. The handwriting of someone who wrote infrequently but wrote with intention. "Open when I am not there to tell you myself." She did not open it. She did not need to. The words existed somewhere anterior to reading, embedded in a place more immediate than memory. She reached into the same pocket and removed a photograph. It was not new. The edges had softened from years of handling. The image had the grain of something printed under field conditions, far from any laboratory. Two people stood in front of a low building with a flag she recognized. The SARC training compound at Coronado. March 2019. A man in his early 50s. Tall, gray at the temples but not yet fully gray. The posture of someone who had spent 30 years standing at attention and no longer needed to think about it. Beside him a young woman, 21 years old, dark hair pulled back. The exhaustion of someone who had just completed something that most people do not complete. And beneath the exhaustion, something else. Something that looked like a rival. Captain Dominic Callahan, Navy SEAL, her father. 8 months after that photograph was taken, he walked into a valley in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, with a 6-man team on a mission that did not exist in any official record. 3 days later, the United States Navy declared him killed in action. No body recovered, file sealed. Reese Callahan was the only member of his team who walked out of that valley. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she put it back in her pocket with the letter and closed her kit and sat in the darkness and waited for morning. 800 miles away in Washington, D.C., a man sat in an office that did not appear on any building directory and read a report that had been delivered by hand 30 minutes earlier. Deputy Director Warren Ashcroft was 61 years old. He had spent 33 of those years in the Central Intelligence Agency in positions of increasing authority and decreasing visibility. He had the face of a man who had learned long ago that the most dangerous things are the things that do not appear dangerous. The report was 3 pages. Task Force Raven, Personnel List, Operational Objectives. His eyes stopped on the second page. R. Callahan, Contract Medical, Forward Position. He read the name twice. Then he picked up the phone on his desk. A phone that did not route through any switchboard and did not appear on any log. "We have a problem." He listened. "The Callahan girl. She is on the Raven task force." He paused. "No, I do not believe in coincidences. Not where that family is concerned." He listened again. "Find out what she knows. Find out what she is looking for. And if she gets too close to Crease before we do." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. The convoy moved south out of Camp Lejeune before the last light had gone. 3 unmarked vehicles running on roads that followed the contour of the land rather than the logic of any civilian map. The Carolinas gave way to Virginia, the way night gives way to deeper night. Not with announcement, but with gradual accumulation. Trees grew denser. Towns grew smaller. The road narrowed until it was less a road than a suggestion. Reese rode in the second vehicle, rear passenger seat, Kit between her feet, hands folded, eyes tracking the darkness outside the window in the way of someone reading it for information rather than looking at it. Elevation changes, sight lines where the tree line broke and exposed a ridge line against the sky, where it closed dense with the kind of cover that means different things depending on which side of it you occupy. Brennan sat in front and did not speak to her. This was not unusual. Brennan rarely spoke in vehicles unless they were taking fire, but the quality of his silence in her direction had a deliberateness to it, a man working through something unresolved. She had felt his eyes in the rearview mirror twice in the last hour. Both times she had been looking out the window and given him nothing to work with. The drive took 4 hours. They staged at a gravel lot outside a decommissioned rail depot 7 miles east of the target zone, under cover of a tree line scouted by satellite 48 hours earlier. Cold, clear night, stars dense and indifferent and very old. The team moved without flashlights. The source was supposed to be inside. A former agency analyst named Harkin, who had operated alongside Crease for 6 years before reassignment, who had 3 days earlier made contact with a DIA intermediary to offer location intelligence, in exchange for a conversation that would not be recorded and would not officially occur. They approached in the standard stack formation, Blackwood at the lead, the team distributing along the approach with the fluid choreography of people who have rehearsed until rehearsal and action become the same thing. Reese moved at the rear of the formation, Kit on her back, breathing even. She had 20 feet left to the door when the first shot came from above. It hit the gravel 6 inches from Blackwood's boot. The second hit the corrugated wall and sent rust and paint fragments into the air. By the third shot, the team had already moved. Not in chaos, but in the disciplined dispersal of men who have spent years practicing for this exact sequence. Cover materialized from the environment with practice speed, a concrete barrier, a rusted equipment housing, the angle of the building itself. Blackwood's voice came through the earpiece. Flat and immediate. Shooter northeast. Roof or upper window. Brennan Shaw, suppress and identify. Hale far flank. Everyone else hold. Reese pressed herself behind the equipment housing. Back to metal. Kit between her knees. She looked northeast. A secondary structure 40 feet from the main depot. A loading platform with a corrugated steel awning partially collapsed on one side, creating an elevated position with a clean line to every approach. She could see the shape of a barrel extending past the awning's edge. She measured the distance the way she had measured distances since childhood. The way her father had taught her. The way that becomes part of how the eye processes the world and cannot be untaught. 860 meters. Maybe 870. Shaw's voice through the earpiece. Controlled, urgent. I am hit. Right arm. I cannot hold the rifle. Barrett is down. I dropped it on the approach. The Barrett M82A1 lay in the open ground between the equipment housing and the depot wall. 30 pounds of precision instrument. .50 caliber. 40 feet of exposed ground beneath a shooter who had established position before they arrived and had all the patience of someone who had chosen his moment with care. Blackwood. Is anyone certified on the M82? Silence. Not the absence of answers. The silence of men calculating whether their answer was yes in the specific context of this distance, this darkness, this valley wind already working on trajectories in ways that required time to quantify properly. Brennan. I have qualified, but not at this range under these conditions. Negative. Negative, Blackwood said. Hold position. The shooter adjusted. A new round came in and hit 6 inches closer to Hale's position. Hale moved, the geometry contracted. Reese looked at the Barrett on the ground. She looked at the distance. She was moving before she finished the thought, low and fast across the exposed ground, in the way she had moved in every environment where moving low and fast had mattered, which was more environments than anyone on this team knew about. She reached the Barrett in 4 seconds. She was already going to ground as her hands found it, belly flat on gravel, the weapon coming into position with the unhurried speed of muscle memory that does not rush because it does not need to. Absolutely not, Brennan said through the earpiece. She pulled the bipod legs down with 2 fingers. Found the scope. The elevated position resolved in the glass with the clarity of cold air and a clear night. She found the barrel, found the shooter behind it, the outline of a man in a position that told her everything about his training and his confidence and his intention. 860 meters. She read the wind. The valley ran northwest to southeast, air moving through it from the west at approximately 9 miles per hour. She read this from the dry grass at the edge of the gravel lot, bending at a consistent angle without significant variation. Valley wind, channeled and relatively predictable, but building for the last 30 minutes, still finding its steady state, still carrying variance she needed to account for. She adjusted the scope. She breathed in through the nose, slow and deliberate, the kind of breath that asks the body to settle rather than commanding it, because the body responds better to asking. Her father's voice, unchanged by years. You do not rush the shot. You prepare the conditions and you wait for the moment. The moment is always there. You are the only variable. She was ready. She squeezed. The recoil of a Barrett M82A1 is not a recoil in the ordinary sense. It is a physical event that moves through the body with the authority of something that does not ask permission. 30 pounds of rifle chambered in 50 BMG. It has broken bones. It has ended careers. For a person not prepared, not physically arranged to receive it, it negotiates nothing. Reese absorbed it because she had arranged herself to receive it, not resisting the force but distributing it across a frame that had been prepared through years of exactly this. The physics understood and accommodated long before the trigger broke. The shot landed 6 inches left of center. She noted the data without frustration. Valley wind carrying a cross current she had underweighted, the kind that appears when secondary drainage cuts through primary flow. She recalculated in 3 seconds, cycled the bolt, reacquired, 4 seconds of stillness. The second shot broke. 860 meters downrange, the shooter on the platform did not move again. The silence that followed lasted 2 full seconds. Then Blackwood's voice came through, the voice of a man performing the act of maintaining composure while his operational framework was being reorganized beneath him. Hale confirm. Target down. No movement. A pause. Then, Callahan. Sit rep. Position secure, she said. I am fine. She was already getting up, pulling the bipod legs back, lifting the Barrett, carrying it to Shaw's position. She set it down and checked his arm, through and through in the outer forearm. No arterial involvement, significant but manageable, and began working before he could tell her he was fine, because fine was not a medical assessment. Clean through, she said. You will keep the arm. Shaw looked at her. He looked at the rifle she had set beside him. He looked at her hands, which were already moving through the sequence of cleaning and packing the wound with the same efficiency he had watched in the medical bay that afternoon, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say that the situation had not already said more clearly. Brennan was standing 10 feet away. He had been standing there since she got up off the ground. He had a rifle in his hands and he was looking at her with an expression that had no simple name. Not disbelief, not respect, not the discomfort of a man who has been wrong in a way that is hard to absorb gracefully. Some combination of all three. Still resolving, he said nothing. Hale came back from the far flank and stopped beside Reese. He waited until she finished with Shaw and stood. Then he crouched to her level and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Sark Pipeline. In 15 years, I met two people who completed it. One went in with a SEAL team in Afghanistan in 2019 and did not come back. A pause. The other had her file pulled in November of that year. Completely. Every record. Like she had never been there. Reese was looking at the ground 6 feet in front of her. She did not look at him. He waited. I have been watching your hands since this morning. The way you held the scope mount during gear check. The way you prepped Pritchard. The way you moved across that ground just now. He paused again. That is not a medic who learned to shoot. That is a shooter who learned to heal. The silence between them had weight. She did not confirm. She did not deny. She kept her eyes on the middle distance and her hands still and her breathing even. And after a moment, Hale nodded once, almost to himself, and stood and walked away. Both of them understood what the silence meant. Neither said so. Blackwood had been watching from 30 feet away. He had watched Hale crouch beside her and watched the conversation and watched Hale stand and walk away. And he had watched Reese's face throughout. The same composed neutrality he had been trying to read since the briefing room. She gave nothing away that she did not choose to give, and she had not yet chosen to give anything that mattered. He walked toward her. She heard him coming and did not turn. Where did you learn to shoot like that? She looked at him then. My father taught me. The words were the same words she had used in the medical bay, but the weight of them was different now. Standing in cold air with a dead shooter on a rooftop and the smell of propellant still present. Blackwood heard the difference even though he could not yet name what it meant. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Your father, yes sir. He turned away and began moving the team toward the fallback position. Because the situation had changed and protocol for changed situations was to move first and process second. He was a soldier. He moved. But those 2 words settled somewhere in his chest and stayed there. And he could not have said precisely why. The fallback position was a farmhouse 3 miles west. Pre-staged. Keys left in an unlocked outbuilding. The kind of arrangement that would not appear in any record of the night. The team redistributed into the vehicles with adjustments for Shaw's arm and the unspoken adjustment of 10 men recalibrating around a fact they had not previously accounted for. Nobody talked. This was different from before. Before the silence had been professional. Now it had texture. The texture of people processing something that requires more than professional silence can hold. Brennan rode in the back seat and looked at the floor the entire way. The farmhouse had 4 rooms, no furniture worth noting, and the particular smell of a building that had been closed for a season and opened quickly. The team moved through it with practiced efficiency, and within 20 minutes there was a map on the kitchen table and a field radio on the windowsill, and Shaw's arm was properly dressed and in a sling. The satellite radio on the windowsill activated at 0130. Reese heard Blackwood cross to it from the adjacent room. She heard the specific quality of stillness that falls when a person reads something and stops moving entirely. Then his voice, controlled. Callahan. She stood. He was at the windowsill with the radio in his hand. He held it out. The message was encoded at the top with a cipher sequence she recognized. Not standard DIA. Something older and more field-specific. Below the header, the text was plain. Colonel Blackwood. She deserves to know what happened in that valley. You signed the order. I have the documentation. Tell her I am not the enemy she was sent to find. Tell her that her father's name is in the file. I will be in contact. Crease. Reese read it twice. She looked at Blackwood. He was looking at the wall above the windowsill, the particular middle distance of a man standing at the edge of something, deciding whether to step forward or back. She waited. His hand tightened on the radio until his knuckles changed color, and that was enough for now. She was practiced at now. She put it in the place where she kept everything that was not yet ready to become words, and she waited for morning to make it ready. Morning came without warmth. The tree line separated from the sky in degrees too slow to observe directly. The world assembling itself back into visibility the way it always did, without announcement, without the ceremony the moment might seem to deserve. The frost on the farmhouse windows had not yet begun to melt. The birds had not yet decided to begin. The only sound was the field radio on the windowsill, cycling through its automated frequency check. A small mechanical heartbeat in an otherwise still house. Reese had not slept. She had sat at the kitchen table and run the calculations she had been running for 4 years. The one that began in a valley in Kunar province at 0200 on a November morning and had not stopped since. Accumulating variables, adjusting for new information, arriving each time at a conclusion she could not yet act on. The message from Kreese had changed the shape of it, not the content. She had known most of what it contained before she ever walked into the briefing room at Camp Lejeune. What had changed was the variable she had built the entire operation around, hoping to confirm, the variable she had not allowed herself to treat as certainty until someone who had been there said it out loud. Her father's name is in the file. She had known Dominic Callahan was alive with the certainty that lives below evidence. In the place where a person knows things about the people they are most connected to, at a depth that neither distance nor official documentation can reach. She had known it the way she knew her own heartbeat, not because she could see it, but because she could feel it, steady beneath everything else, continuous, a signal that had never gone dark. But knowing and hearing it confirmed from the mouth of someone who had been in that valley were different things. And the difference had a weight she had not fully anticipated. And she sat with it through the cold hours before dawn in the quiet farmhouse kitchen, with her hands flat on the table, and the letter in her inside pocket and the photograph in her kit, and she waited. At 0350, she heard Blackwood's footsteps in the adjacent room. She heard him stop moving. She heard the specific quality of stillness that falls over a man who has made a decision about something he has been avoiding and is now standing on the near side of it, which is always the harder side. Then his footsteps again, deliberate, moving toward the kitchen. He came to the doorway and stood with his hands at his sides. He was still in his field clothes from the night before, and he looked like what he was, a man who had not slept, who had spent the hours since midnight doing the same arithmetic she had been doing, arriving at the same answer she had arrived at years ago, and finding it heavier than he had been prepared for. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And he put his hands flat on the table the way she had her hands flat. And for a few seconds they were just two people sitting across from each other in a cold farmhouse kitchen with the field radio cycling on the windowsill and the frost still on the windows and the morning still deciding whether to begin. October 2019. His voice was level, controlled. The voice of a man delivering a report on something he was not proud of, which required more discipline than the voice of a man delivering a report on something he was. And he had enough discipline for it, and he used all of it. I was JSOC liaison for Delta Force. My commanding officer passed me a memorandum requesting a signature on what was described as a standard non-acknowledgement protocol. Tier 1 team inside a special access program. The language was what I had seen before in similar documents. If the operation is compromised, it is not acknowledged. Extraction is not authorized. Personnel records are managed accordingly. He paused. I signed it because I was told it was routine. Low risk. A small team going in to recover a single asset. I was told the window was narrow and the paperwork needed to move. Reese said nothing. I signed it. He said again. Not louder. Just more deliberate. The way a man says a thing again when he wants to make certain the record is clear. I signed it and I sent it back through my CO, and I did not think about it again for 11 days. What was the date? October 28th. She looked at him across the table. My father's team went into the Kunar Valley on October 31st. He was already on the aircraft when you signed that paper. He was 3 hours from the ground. Blackwood held her gaze. He did not look away. She gave him credit for that. Did you know? No. Clear. Immediate. When I found out which team the protocol had been applied to, the operation had already been closed. The casualty report said 6 KIA. No recoverable remains. I requested an internal review through my CO. I was told the file was sealed at SAP level and no review would be authorized. A pause long enough to carry weight. I asked twice more over the following 3 months. I was told the same thing. And then I stopped asking. The kitchen was completely still. Why? Because I was told there was nothing left to find. He looked at his hands on the table. And because I wanted to believe that, because the alternative, that I had signed a document that left American servicemen without extraction authority and then been lied to about the outcome, was a thing I did not want to hold. He looked back up. I have spent 4 years understanding that not wanting to hold something is not the same as it not being true. Reese looked at him for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was the same voice it always was, flat and even, the voice of someone who has learned to carry difficult information without letting the emotion that surrounds it distort the signal. I know you did not intend it, she said. I have known that for 2 years. I did not come here to punish you for it. He waited. I came here because I needed a commander whose name on a sworn statement would carry institutional weight that a former SARC with an expunged record cannot generate on her own. She held his eyes. You signed a document that removed the safety net from a team that included my father. You can sign another one that tells the truth about what happened. That statement creates a record. The record changes the arithmetic for the people who would prefer my father remain officially dead. She paused. You cannot undo the first signature, but the second one means something. And I think you already know that, which is why you are sitting here at 0350 instead of sleeping. He looked at her steadily, a long silence. Then he said, What do you need from me? It was not a question. It had stopped being a question the moment he sat down. Reese reached into her kit and placed a photograph on the table. It was not new. The edges had softened from years of handling. The image had the grain of something printed under field conditions, far from any laboratory. She had carried it for 3 years in the inside pocket of every jacket she owned, through 3 countries, 2 deployments, 1 hospital stay, and it had come through all of it still legible, still saying exactly what it had always said. In the photograph, a man lay on a cot in a low-ceiling room with stone walls. An IV line ran into his left arm. His face was turned toward the camera. His eyes were closed. The bandaging around his chest was visible beneath an open blanket. He was clearly injured, but his color was the color of a man in the process of recovering. Not a man at the end of one. In the lower right corner, handwritten in ink that had faded to gray, a date. November 14th, 2019, 11 days after the date printed on Dominic Callahan's official casualty notification. 11 days after the United States Navy had formally declared him killed in action with no recoverable remains. 11 days during which a man who was supposed to be dead was instead lying in an unidentified room with stone walls. Breathing, recovering, very much alive. Blackwood picked up the photograph. He held it at the angle a man holds something when he needs the light to confirm what he thinks he is seeing and is hoping the light will tell him he is wrong. He looked at it for a long time. His face went through something during those seconds. Something controlled and effortful and not entirely successful. The kind of movement a man's face makes when what he is looking at is colliding with what he has believed for 4 years. And the collision has consequences he has not yet fully calculated. He set the photograph down. His hands were no longer entirely steady. Where did you get this? It was left for me, Reese said, by someone who wanted me to keep looking. She looked at the photograph. I have been looking ever since. She let that sit in the space between them. His name is in the file that Kreese is carrying. Kreese knows where he is. Kreese has been keeping him alive for 4 years at considerable personal cost. And the people who ordered the original closure have now found out he is still alive, which is why Kreese went off the grid 3 weeks ago with the file as a deterrent. She looked at Blackwood. This meeting this morning is the most important thing that has happened in 4 years. And when it is done, your sworn statement is the mechanism that keeps my father from becoming an inconvenience someone decides to address permanently. Blackwood sat with the photograph and the weight of it for a long moment. Then he nodded once. The way a soldier nods when the order is clear, and the cost has been calculated, and the calculation has come out on the side of moving forward regardless of the cost. You will have it, he said. Everything I know, everything I signed, everything I should have kept asking about. A pause. Everything. Reese put the photograph back in her kit. We move at 0400. She stood up and walked out of the kitchen. And behind her, Blackwood sat alone at the table, with his hands in front of him and the cold light of the early morning beginning to come through the windows. Gray and honest and without mercy. He sat there for 7 minutes. Then he stood up and went to prepare for the mission. At 0400, the team assembled without being summoned. They gathered around the map in the kitchen, and Blackwood laid out what the DIA contact had returned overnight. Kreese had provided a location, a farmstead 14 miles northeast in a fold of the Blue Ridge, where two ridge lines met and created a natural depression invisible from any road. Accessible by a single logging track not maintained in several years. He would be there at 0900. He would come alone. Two options: tactical approach, surround the position, treat Kreese as a subject to be secured, or contact approach, send someone in to talk. Brennan, we do not know what is at that position. Could be a setup, stated without inflection, a legitimate operational concern from a man who had learned to raise them. Hale, a man running a setup does not send a message naming the people he wants to meet. Blackwood looked at Reese. He has been 14 miles from where we staged for 3 weeks. He reached out instead of relocating. He wants the meeting. A pause. He said he is not the enemy we were sent to find, and I believe him. Brennan looked at the map, said nothing more. Contact approach, Blackwood said. Callahan goes in, full perimeter at distance. No engagement without signal. He looked around the table. Questions? No questions. The logging track was exactly as described. Narrow, reclaimed by vegetation. The ruts deep from seasonal freeze. The forest close on both sides. They left the vehicles at the tree line and walked in. The team distributing through the woods in a perimeter that tightened as the farmstead came into view. Small structure, main building and equipment shed, both weathered to the gray of wood that has faced mountain winters longer than anyone currently paying attention. No vehicles, no visible personnel. The depression held the property in a natural bowl that would have made it invisible from the air in summer and merely difficult in winter. Blackwood designated positions. Brennan on the west, Hale wide on the north flank, two others on the east ridge covering elevated ground. Pritchard anchoring the south with a sight line to the main door. Nobody moves without my call, Blackwood said. Nobody engages without signal from Callahan. He looked at her. She crossed the open ground alone. The door opened before she reached it. Sullivan Kreese was 52 years old and had been running for 3 weeks on a leg wound, he addressed himself. And he looked it. Pallor beneath his skin from sustained blood loss. Leaning slightly to one side in a way he was working not to show. The eyes of a man who had been making careful decisions for a very long time and had arrived at the point where careful was no longer sufficient by itself. He looked at her. You look like him. Same way of standing. Where is he? He stepped back from the door. Inside, a sleeping bag against the wall, a camp stove, a pack opened and repacked many times over, and on the floor near the pack an aluminum case, latched, the kind used for documents that require protection from the elements, and from the people who would prefer they did not exist. Kreese sat because standing was spending more than he had. He extended the wounded leg and looked at her. Stonegate, I was the case officer. I received the closure order when the team's position was compromised. You know what closure means in that context. Tell me the rest, he told her. Your father and one other member of the team were alive when I reached the valley. I had 40 minutes before the documentation window closed. After that, I would lose control of what the record said. I made a decision that I cannot defend within any official framework. I have not tried to defend it. I would make it again. 11 days in a location that exists in no record, a physician whose name appears in no database, the decision to move Dominic Callahan rather than report him, the understanding between them unspoken but complete, that returning through official channels was not a path that the operations architects would permit to remain open. New identity, new location. The arrangement that had held for 4 years. Stay small, stay quiet, stay alive. He knew the cost, Kreese said. No contact with family. He understood what he was agreeing to. Is he alive? She had known the answer for 4 years. She had known it with a certainty that did not require evidence. But she was here because certainty is not the same as confirmation, and confirmation is not the same as seeing, and she had not yet seen. Kreese looked at her. As of 3 months ago. Yes. She stood with that for a moment, just a moment. She had learned long ago that moments like this one required a specific kind of handling, not suppression, not performance, but the deliberate act of receiving information fully while remaining functional. The way you receive news you have been waiting 4 years to hear. Not with celebration, not with tears, but with the quiet acknowledgement that the waiting was finally over. She let it settle into her, where it belonged. The file, what else is in it? He told her. 23 names, active intelligence assets in 4 countries. Documented without their knowledge inside a program, assembled as insurance by a man who was no longer in a position to use it, and who had passed it to Kreese through a chain of custody that was now 2 people long. Both of whom were sitting in this room. 23 people whose lives depended on the file going nowhere near its intended buyer. I took it to protect one man, Kreese said. I did not understand what else was inside until it was too late to put it back. I have been carrying both the file and that failure for 3 weeks. You should have gone to the agency. The agency is the organization that wants me dead. She looked at the aluminum case. Then she looked at his leg. I am going to look at that wound. He blinked. We are in the middle of? I can do 2 things at once. She was already opening her kit. Tell me about the transfer. Time and location. He told her while she cut away the improvised dressing and assessed what 3 weeks of inadequate care had produced. Surface closure over an infection that needed drainage. The predictable result of a field-dressed wound left in cold conditions without follow-up. She cleaned it without asking whether it hurt because the answer was self-evident and changed nothing about the procedure. The transfer was scheduled 48 hours from now. He said, a cutout acting as intermediary. The file reaches the cutout. The cutout reaches a foreign intelligence service that has been trying to rebuild its human intelligence networks for nearly a decade. 23 names would give them a decade of shortcuts. He paused. I have been the only thing standing between that transaction and completion for 3 weeks. I am aware of how contingent that is. Not anymore, she said. She was closing the secondary dressing when the first shot came through the east wall. It crossed the interior at the angle of a shooter using elevation. Someone on the ridgeline above the depression, positioned before dawn, patient, through the east wall and through the opposite wall without hitting anyone. Ranging shot, establishing 0. The second would not be exploratory. Through the earpiece, Hale's voice, controlled and tight. Contact northeast ridgeline, single shooter with full elevation advantage. He has the entire depression, then Brennan. Cannot get an angle from the west. He is too high. She was already moving to the east wall. Then a different sound. Rotors. Distant but building. Coming from the east. Hale again. 2 helicopters, unmarked. Inbound from the east. Arrival 3 minutes. Reese looked at Kreese. His face had changed. The pallor replaced by something harder. The face of a man who had been waiting for this and hoping it would not come, and knowing it would. Ashcroft. He found me. Who is Ashcroft? Deputy Director Warren Ashcroft, CIA. The man who ordered Stonegate. The man who signed the closure when the mission went wrong. He paused. The man who wants your father dead. Permanently this time. She pressed flat beside the hole the first round had made and looked through it. The ridgeline rose 300 feet above the depression. At the crest, a natural rock formation providing cover. The rifle barrel extended past the rock at an angle that told her the shooter was right-handed, body-oriented northeast, which created a specific gap in his field of view to the south, a gap he would need to reposition to cover. Distance from the east wall to the crest of the ridgeline, 1,050 meters. The shoulder wound from the night before communicated itself clearly under the movement, a specific burn from joint to mid-arm. She registered it, assessed it in the way she assessed all incoming information, and set it aside. It would be worse tomorrow. Tomorrow was a separate problem. Blackwood's voice through the earpiece. Callahan, can you take the shot? She looked at the Barrett on her back. She had carried it from the vehicles. No one had questioned the decision at the time, and she had not explained it because explanations before the fact were a form of asking for permission she did not need. Yes, a half-second pause that held more than half a second of content. Do it. She went to her knee at the east wall, pulled the bipod legs down, found the scope. The depression created complicated wind, the bowl shape of the terrain generating eddies invisible from the high ground. The first and most common mistake in terrain like this being to read the elevated wind and apply it to the low position. She watched the dry grass at the base of the wall. She watched the smoke from the camp stove drifting through the hole beside her. She built the real picture of the air between her and the crest, not the obvious picture that the easy information suggested. Through the earpiece, he is repositioning, moving to close his gap. Pritchard's flank will be exposed in seconds. She breathed out slowly, letting the tension leave her shoulders, letting the pain in her arm become background noise. The body knew what to do. She had trained it for exactly this. Her father's voice, the same voice that had taught her to hold a rifle before she could drive a car. Breathe, settle, trust the preparation. The moment will find you. The shooter settled into his new position, between heartbeats, in the fraction of a second when the body reaches the stillness it was designed to find. She squeezed the trigger. The Barrett moved through her the way it always had, not against her, but through her, distributed across a frame prepared to receive it years before this moment. The physics understood and accommodated long before the trigger broke. 1,050 meters. The shooter on the ridge line did not move again. 1,050 meters. Through valley wind. With a wounded shoulder, one shot. The rifle settled against her collarbone. The familiar weight, the familiar silence after. Hail from the north flank. Target down. Ridgeline clear. Brennan. East flank secure. 2 additional contacts neutralized. Then Blackwood. A pause before he spoke. Brief but not empty. Callahan. Status. All clear inside, she said. Crease needs a surgical team within 6 hours. Leg wound with secondary infection. She looked at the aluminum case on the floor where it had been sitting since she walked in. The package is intact, but the helicopters were still coming. The sound of the rotors grew louder, closer. The trees at the edge of the depression beginning to sway from the downdraft. Crease looked at her. Ashcroft will not stop. He has too much to lose. If the file reaches the Senate Intelligence Committee, everything he did in Stonegate becomes a matter of record. He paused. He would rather kill everyone in this clearing than let that happen. The first helicopter broke over the tree line and descended into the depression. Black, unmarked. The kind of aircraft that does not exist in any official inventory. The second held position above, providing overwatch. Men in tactical gear dropped from the first helicopter before it fully touched ground. 8 of them, moving with the precision of professionals, and behind them, stepping out of the helicopter with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned every variable in the situation. Warren Ashcroft, 61 years old, silver hair immaculate despite the wind, a suit that cost more than most people made in a month. The face of a man who had spent 33 years making difficult decisions and had learned to sleep through the consequences. He looked around the clearing until he found Reese, and he smiled. Task Force Raven, his voice carried across the depression, clear and controlled. The voice of a man who had been giving orders for so long, he no longer distinguished between giving them and stating facts. You are interfering with a classified intelligence operation. Stand down and surrender your weapons. Blackwood stepped forward, his team forming behind him. We are operating under DIA authority. Our mission parameters are clear. Ashcroft's smile did not change. Your mission parameters are whatever I say they are. The DIA has no jurisdiction here. This is an agency matter. He took 3 steps toward the farmhouse, toward Reese, toward the case. Sullivan Crease is a traitor in possession of classified material. That case belongs to the Central Intelligence Agency. I am here to recover it. Reese stepped out of the doorway. The Barrett was still on her back. Her hands were empty. Her face carried the same composed neutrality it had carried since the briefing room at Camp Lejeune. But something had changed. The quality of the stillness around her had a weight to it now. The weight of someone who had been waiting for this moment for 4 years and had finally arrived at it. Ashcroft looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time something flickered across his face. A recognition he had not anticipated, a calculation he had not made. "You are the Callahan girl." She did not answer. He took another step toward her. "I read your file, what was left of it. Special Amphibious Reconnaissance Corpsman, top of your class." Then suddenly nothing. Records expunged, like you had never existed. He tilted his head slightly. "I wondered what happened to you. After the valley." Reese held her position. "You know what happened in that valley." "Do I?" "You ordered the closure. When the mission went wrong, you signed the document that left 6 Americans without extraction authority, without support, without any official acknowledgement that they had ever been there." His face did not change. "I made a decision, a difficult decision, the kind of decision that people like you do not understand, because you have never had to make them." My father understood. The words landed with a weight that surprised even her. He understood that the country he had served for 30 years had decided he was more useful dead than alive. He understood that the men who sent him into that valley had already written off his life before he ever left the aircraft. She took one step forward, and he understood that someone in a comfortable office in Washington was going to spend the next 4 years hoping he stayed dead so the paperwork would stay clean. Ashcroft's smile had faded. "Your father is dead, officially and actually, whatever fantasy you have constructed." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the photograph, held it up so he could see it clearly. "November 14th, 2019, 11 days after you declared him KIA, 3 days after you closed the file." She watched his face. She watched the moment the recognition landed. "He is alive," she said. "He has been alive for 4 years, and you have known it, which is why you are here, not for the file, for the name in the file, for the proof that your closure failed." Ashcroft's eyes moved to the case on the floor behind her, then back to her face. "That file is the property of the Central Intelligence Agency. Whatever personal grievance you think you have, that file contains the names of 23 active intelligence assets in 4 countries. Assets who were documented without their knowledge, without authorization, as part of an insurance policy assembled by men who knew they might need leverage someday." She paused. "Men like you." The clearing was very still. Ashcroft's team had spread out behind him. 8 men in tactical positions, weapons ready. Blackwood's team held their positions, 7 men and 1 woman. Outgunned, outpositioned, but not outmatched. Ashcroft looked at Blackwood. "Colonel, I know your record. I know what you signed in October 2019. I know what it would mean for your career if that signature became a matter of public record." He let that sit. "Walk away. Take your team. Leave the girl in the file, and none of this needs to go any further." Blackwood did not move. The silence stretched. Then he took one step forward, and another, until he was standing between Reese and Ashcroft. "I signed a document in October 2019. His voice was steady. "I signed it because I was told it was routine. I signed it because I trusted my chain of command." He looked at Ashcroft directly. "You used that trust. You used my signature to abandon American servicemen in a valley on the other side of the world. And then you lied about it for 4 years." Ashcroft's face had gone hard. "Be very careful, Colonel." "I have been careful," Blackwood said, "for 4 years, and it has cost me something I am no longer willing to pay." He looked back at Reese, then forward again. "Whatever happens in this clearing, whatever comes after, the signature you are worried about is already part of a sworn statement, filed with the Senate Armed Services Committee through a legal intermediary, in a location where it cannot be conveniently lost or reclassified or made to disappear." He paused. "The arithmetic has already changed. You just did not know it yet." Behind Blackwood, Brennan moved, then Hale, then Pritchard, then Shaw, his arm still in a sling, his weapon still steady. One by one, the team assembled behind their commander, behind Reese, a line that had not existed that morning. Ashcroft looked at them. He looked at the helicopters. He looked at the clearing. And for the first time, his confidence showed a crack. Reese stepped forward, past Blackwood, until she was standing 6 feet from Warren Ashcroft. The file contains 23 names, 23 people who will die if this information reaches the wrong hands. She held his gaze. I do not want that. Whatever you think of me, whatever this has cost. I do not want 23 people to die because of a decision made in a valley 4 years ago. Ashcroft said nothing. So here is what is going to happen. She reached down and picked up the aluminum case. This file goes to the Senate Intelligence Committee, not the agency, not your oversight. The committee. She opened the case, looked at the contents, closed it again. 23 names, protected. Your involvement in Stonegate, documented, but not disclosed, not publicly, not as long as certain conditions are met. What conditions? My father lives, publicly, with his name restored and his record cleared. No more hiding, no more running, no more pretending he is dead. She paused. That is the price. His life for your career. Ashcroft looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, the variables being weighed, the outcomes being assessed. Finally, he spoke. You are bluffing. You do not have the resources to protect that file, to manage a disclosure that complex. Reese did not blink. 3 copies, 3 different locations, 3 different people with instructions to release everything if I do not check in within 48 hours. She tilted her head slightly. I have had 4 years to prepare for this moment, Deputy Director. Did you think I came here without a plan? The silence stretched. The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the depression. The rotors on the hovering helicopter continued their steady beat. And Warren Ashcroft, who had spent 33 years making difficult decisions, made one more. He turned away, walked back toward the helicopter, stopped, looked back over his shoulder. You are like your father, he said. He was always better at the long game than anyone gave him credit for. A pause. I will be watching if any part of that file becomes public. Any name, any operation, any detail. I will find you. He waited for her to flinch. She did not. And I will be ready. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he climbed into the helicopter. And the helicopters rose and banked and disappeared over the ridgeline and were gone. The clearing held a different quality now. The tension had broken. What remained was not peace exactly. It was something more earned than that. The stillness of people who had chosen a side and discovered they could live with the choice. The echo of the rotors faded into the mountain air. The team stood in the positions they had taken, processing what had happened, what it meant, what came next. Blackwood walked toward Reese. He stopped 3 feet away. He reached up to his left lapel. The trident pin was small and worn to mat. The gold finished by 30 years of friction and fabric, and the daily weight of what it represented. He had worn it since the day it was placed on him, which was a long time ago, and a long distance from this clearing. Neither the time nor the distance had changed what it meant. He held it out. She looked at it for a moment. She took it. Neither of them spoke. Brennan stood 10 feet away with his eyes fixed on the tree line, which was the direction a man looks when he does not want what he is feeling to show on his face, and the tree line was the best available option. Hale looked at the frost on the ground. Shaw flexed his wounded arm once, testing the limits of what it could still do, finding them acceptable. Pritchard watched Reese with the particular attention of someone who owed her something that could not be repaid, and was not trying to repay it, just acknowledging it existed. Then Blackwood said quietly enough that only she could hear it. You knew about me before you walked into that briefing room? Yes, the memorandum, the date, the connection to your father's team, everything that was in the record that had not been sealed. He was quiet for a moment. You arranged the DIA request, the one that put you on this team by name. I needed a team with sufficient clearance to operate near Crease without triggering agency protocols. She met his eyes. And I needed a commander whose sworn statement would carry institutional weight that a former SARC with an expunged record could not provide alone. You could have come to me directly, before any of this. She looked at him. You called me an intern before I sat down. You called me a liar before you had grounds for it. A pause. Some people need the demonstration before they can receive the argument. That is not a criticism. It is an observation about how knowledge works and how trust is built in environments like ours. He absorbed that. That is a more generous interpretation of my failures than I deserve. And it is the accurate one, she said. You signed a document under false pretenses and stopped asking questions you should have kept asking. Those are real failures, and they had real consequences, and you will carry them. But you are here, and you sat across from me at 0350 and told the truth about what you signed before I could use it against you. And that is a choice you made freely. She paused. That counts. He looked past her at the ridgeline where the shooter had been, then back at her. You will have the statement, everything, my CO, the memorandum, what I was told, what I later learned, what I should have done, everything. She nodded once. They walked out of the clearing, not side by side, but in the same direction, which was sufficient, and behind them the frost on the grass released the morning light it had briefly been holding, and the day went forward. 6 months later, the dark circles under her eyes had faded. She had put back the weight she had lost. 8 pounds, accumulated in the ordinary way of a person whose days had come to include meals at predictable hours and sleep that ran past 3 in the morning without interruption. The shoulder had healed cleanly. 4 weeks of physical therapy completed with the same patience she applied to everything that required time rather than force, which was most things worth doing. The program was called Integrated Combat Medicine. It convened at 0700 on Tuesdays and Thursdays in a building at a Carolina base that had been used for storage until Blackwood requisitioned it. Hale helped move the paperwork through 3 departments that each believed the other had final authority. And Reese spent 4 consecutive evenings at a folding table writing a curriculum until it was exactly what it needed to be. 16 chairs, 16 students. A phrase at the top of the first page that she had not invented, but had recognized as true the moment she heard it, because Pritchard had said it in a clearing while waiting for a helicopter. His hand pressed over a tourniquet that was holding, his color improving by degrees. Watching the woman who had placed it stand up and do something else entirely. Drag them out alive. The phrase had moved through the base and then to adjacent installations, and then into a formal conversation with the VA's training division that had produced a proposal to expand the curriculum to installations in 3 additional states. She attended the planning meetings and answered questions directly, and declined to be photographed for the internal newsletter someone suggested. And the program continued and grew without requiring her to be the face of it, which was precisely how she preferred it. Pritchard was in the first cohort. He arrived on the first Tuesday with everything healed. Arm, leg, and whatever it is that heals more slowly than the body and without a clear timeline. He sat in the front row and listened with the specific quality of attention that belongs to a person who knows the material has already changed the outcome of their life and is interested in what it might do for other people's. He did not tell the other students what he had seen in the Blue Ridge. He did not need to. The way he paid attention said it plainly enough. He stayed after the 3rd session when the other students had filed out. He looked at her across the empty room. You had a tourniquet on my leg and a rifle in your hands. At the same time, sequential, she said. Not simultaneous. The tourniquet was first. I know what you told me. I am telling you what it looked like from where I was lying. She gathered her notes from the table and did not answer. But she did not contradict him either, and Pritchard understood the distinction and accepted it as the confirmation it was. Brennan sent an email on a Wednesday at 2300. 5 sentences, no subject line. The hour suggested he had been deciding whether to send it since sometime before dinner. I was wrong about you from the beginning. I knew it after the depot, and I did not know how to say so. I am saying it now because I have decided that not knowing how to say something is not a sufficient reason not to say it. You are the best operator I have encountered in a long time, and I have encountered a great many. I am glad I was wrong. She read it twice. She filed it. She did not respond because the correct answer to a man choosing honesty about his own error is to receive the honesty without diminishing it by making it comfortable. And silence was the most respectful thing she had available. Blackwood submitted the sworn statement 11 days after the Blue Ridge. It went through the legal intermediary, routed to the Senate Armed Services Committee, placed into a protected record in a location where it could not be conveniently lost or reclassified or made to disappear by someone with the clearance to do so. The documentation around Stonegate was not public. It would possibly never be public, but it existed, and the people who needed to know it existed had been informed. And the arithmetic of risk that governed decisions about inconvenient survivors had shifted in the direction that made Dominic Callahan's continued existence the less complicated option for everyone with a stake in the matter. Reese drove to Montana in October. 3 days. She did not fly because the drive was something she required. The accumulation of miles, the way the country opened past the Missouri River and did not close again until the mountains began. The quality of space that cannot be compressed into the duration of a flight without losing something that matters. She drove alone with the window down past the point where the cold made that sensible. Because the cold was not the point. The highway stretched before her in the way highways do in that part of the country. Long and straight and honest about the distance still to cover. She passed through towns that existed primarily as names on signs and gas stations that had been there longer than anyone could remember, and fields that had been planted and harvested so many times the land itself had forgotten what it was before. She thought about the last 4 years, about the photographs she had carried through 3 countries, about the letters she had memorized without trying, about the moments in between that had required her to choose between hope and evidence, and had taught her that sometimes hope is its own kind of evidence. She thought about her mother, who had spent 4 years believing she had lost her husband and had learned 3 months ago that she had not, and who had said on the phone, "Bring him home," in a voice that carried 4 years of grief transformed into something that might eventually become joy. She thought about the man she was driving toward, who had spent 4 years being dead on paper and alive in a place where no one knew his name, and who had agreed to that because the alternative was worse, and who was waiting now in a house in Montana for a daughter he had not seen since a valley in Afghanistan, where they had both learned what the people they served were willing to do. She drove, and the miles accumulated, and the distance closed. The house was small and solid in the way of a structure built by someone who had decided to stop moving and start remaining. A woodpile against the east wall, stacked with the precision of someone who understood that preparation is not pessimism. A kitchen garden put to bed for winter with the care of a person who intended to plant it again in spring. The kind of place that looks exactly like what it is. A life being lived quietly on its own terms, without apology. Her mother was on the porch. They had spoken 2 months before, 3 hours covering the 4 years between them, with the imperfect, genuine effort of two people who loved each other and had been carrying grief separately and were ready now to try carrying it together. Her mother had cried, and then stopped, and said what she needed to say. And Reese had listened without interrupting. And at the end, her mother had said, "Bring him home," as if home were something you could make anywhere, which Reese had come to believe was true. As if home were less a place than a decision made by the people who choose to occupy the same space and mean it. She got out of the truck. The door of the house opened. Dominic Callahan was 56 years old. His hair had gone entirely gray in 4 years. The way hair goes when a man has been carrying the weight of sustained absence and the daily discipline of remaining invisible in a world that has officially declared him gone. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame and looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been holding in his mind for a very long time. As an image, a fixed point, a version of a person preserved in the last moment he saw her, and is now confronted with the reality which is both more and less than the image, and neither more nor less than enough. She walked toward him across the frozen ground. There were no words that needed to happen first. There is a silence between people separated by years and by circumstances that were not chosen, who are now standing in the same physical space for the first time, for reasons that required considerable cost from everyone involved. It is the fullest silence there is, more articulate than anything language can carry. It requires nothing from either person except the willingness to stand in it without rushing toward the other side, without filling it with sound before it has finished saying what it needs to say. They stood in it. Her mother had stopped pretending to look elsewhere. She was watching directly with the expression of a person witnessing something that is costing her something precious and that she would not trade for the return of that cost. Not for anything. After a long time, Dominic Callahan put one hand on the side of his daughter's face. He said nothing. She said nothing. Above them, the Montana sky was the pale, enormous, honest color of a sky that has decided not to pretend about winter. Vast and cold and clear, and carrying more stars than any sky near a city ever showed. In the distance, the mountains held their positions as mountains always do, without comment, without adjustment for the smallness of what was happening at their feet, which was as all things that truly matter tend to be, very small and very large at the same time. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday at 06:55, her phone activated on the table beside her coffee. Blackwood. New briefing 0800 Thursday. When you are ready. She set the phone down. She looked out the window at the Carolina morning, assembling itself with the patience of mornings that have no reason to hurry. The frost on the grass, the tree line at the edge of the base catching the first light at an angle that would shift in 20 minutes and be different tomorrow and different every day as the season turned toward longer days. The ordinary, irreplaceable fact of a morning beginning and the people in it still present to receive it. She thought about her father in the Montana house, learning the rhythms of a life that was no longer required to be invisible. She thought about Pritchard in the front row with his careful attention. She thought about Brennan's email sent at 2300 by a man who had decided that not knowing how to say something was not sufficient reason not to say it. She thought about Blackwood in the kitchen at 0350, his hands flat on the table, saying I signed it twice so that the record would be clear. She thought about the team that had formed behind her in a clearing in the Blue Ridge, one by one, until they were a line that had not existed that morning. She thought about what it meant to be trusted, and what it cost, and what it was worth. She picked up the phone, typed 2 words, I am ready. She set the phone down and picked up her coffee and looked out at the morning. And the morning looked back with the same steady patience it had always had, asking nothing, offering everything, the way mornings do for the people still present to receive them. Outside, the frost on the grass held the light for exactly as long as it was able. Then the sun moved on and the day went forward into whatever it was going to be. The end. To Brenda Mont.